Good evening. On behalf of the members and friends of Countryside Community Church, I welcome you to this evening's program. I have been looking forward to this tremendously. I've been a Jim Antal fan for a number of years. But before getting to that, if you happen to be new to the church, we want to especially welcome you and thank you for coming, and also greet those of you who are online joining us tonight remotely. If you can care to stick around for some coffee and fellowship afterwards, we have that available. And also, if you're looking for a restroom between now and afterwards, you just simply go out and make a left, and you'll hit the restrooms. Basically, you'll see the signs. Also, if you'll take your cell phones and turn them either to off or vibrate or stun or whatever it takes to get them not to ring, that would be very much appreciated. Jim Antal, I knew of him and was an admirer already a number of years ago, but I never actually spent much time until, was it 3 years ago? I think it was 3 years ago. He spoke for the Nebraska Conference of the United Church of Christ and gave the keynote, and all I can really say is my response to his talk was, here is a modern day prophet. I'm actually seeing in real life someone who would have been straight out of the Bible. And the ongoing attestation of that is that my life has not been the same ever since hearing him speak 3 years ago about climate and about the role of faith community in it. So be forewarned, if his talk has effect on you, anywhere close to the effect it has had on me, we're going to want to talk for a good long time afterwards, because maybe we're going to want to get something done about climate and the faith community in it. But let me invite forward our director for the Center for Faith Studies, Kelly Keller, who will provide an actual introduction for our guest.
Well, thank you all for braving the cold outside, and I apologize if it's a little chilly inside as well tonight and coming. I do want to recognize a few people. I want to thank Dr. Elnes, our minister, and Chris Alexander, and the congregation of Countryside Community Church for their continued support of the Center for Faith Studies. I do want to recognize that KIOS is here, and they will be rebroadcasting our events. So these events have a reach beyond the evening. We had a lunch today where we were speaking with, actually provided an opportunity for almost 40 clergy to talk about how to talk about climate from the pulpit. So just so you know that these CFS events have a reach beyond what you even see this evening. Also want to thank our volunteers that you saw with the blue ribbon on their badges, and these programs could not exist without them. And lastly, tonight I'd like to acknowledge two particular partners, community partners we have for this evening. Citizens Climate Lobby, Nebraskans for Peace. Mark, if you'd raise your hand. And we also have Reverend Kim Morrow of Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light. And she is with us this evening. And we do have a table of their materials, and they'll be available after the evening for if you have questions about ways that you can put your concerns into action in the local level. They are brilliant people that are tirelessly working on this. The Center for Faith Studies has been faithfully asking the question for over 10 years. What does it mean to be a people through whom God is experienced? We invite speakers who are passionate about the continued interplay of theology, humanities, the sciences, and the social issues of our time. This year, we are exploring the theme of a God who begs the people to let God dwell with them. Tonight's topic, creation story, shaped by hope in a climate crisis world, gets at the heart of this premise. If God created the world for us to dwell in and abide with God, what does it mean for us when that very dwelling place appears to be threatened? We are pleased to have with us the Reverend Dr. Jim Antal, who serves the Massachusetts Conference of the United Church of Christ. Very pleased, as he spent a lot of time in Chicago that he didn't need to spend today, and we were wondering, is he going to get here? As you can read in your program, he authored famously the resolution to divest from fossil fuel companies and was able to usher that through, which is probably the more important aspect than the authoring, which is that he has put his faith into action. He is engaged in the spiritual discipline of civil disobedience numerous times, most recently at the White House to stop the Keystone Pipeline. He provides leadership for the Massachusetts Conference Environmental Ministries Group and regularly convenes the New England Regional Environmental Ministries reps from the 6 New England UCC conferences, this Saturday, in fact. He speaks frequently in churches, regionally and nationally, on the essential role, the unique role people of faith must play to counter climate change. Prior to his current calling, Jim served in congregations in Ohio and Boston. In 1998, he received a Doctor of Ministry degree from Andover Newton Theological School and was also the recipient of the Rabbi Murray Rotham Prize for his contributions to, which would be interesting to Countryside members, interfaith community relations. He worked as executive secretary of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the oldest and one of the largest national religious interfaith peace organizations in the United States. Tonight, he invites us to consider the bleak reports of science on the future of this earth and resist the urge to pretend it isn't happening, or the opposite, to give up and wait forlornly for the end. Instead, he will invite us to rally our faith, to bring hope to a very real crisis before us, a message we not only need to hear, but take deeply into our souls and share with others. Please join me in providing a very warm welcome to Dr. Antal. Did you turn those on?
I turned them on. Test. 1, 2, 3. Sound good? Great. One thing about Nebraska is Nebraska offers great hospitality, and it's just so great to be back here. I'll have more to say about that in a minute, but I want to begin by beginning with Scripture. This is not a sermon, okay? So if you came here expecting a sermon, it's not going to be a sermon, but I do want to begin with 2 brief Scripture passages, the first from the 9th chapter of Genesis. As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, every animal of the earth that is with you, as many as come out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I will make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth." And the other passage is the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount that comes to us from the 7th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. "Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on a rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was its fall." So I'm delighted to return to Nebraska, and especially to be here as part of Countryside's Center for Faith Studies lecture series. When Kelly first contacted me, I was not aware of the conversation that this congregation is now having to possibly join Omaha's Tri-Faith Initiative, and the further possibility that a church might be built that would be the greenest house of worship in the country. What a witness it would be for a world in such deep need of reconciliation of different faith perspectives, and reconciliation with God's creation. You can count on my prayerful support as you venture forward in this incredibly important witness of hope. And if you have some kind of fundraising campaign associated with it, I'll write a check. Now, one of the reasons I've been looking forward to coming to Omaha is that when I spoke here a few years ago at the Nebraska Conference UCC annual meeting, it was immediately clear to me how connected people are in Nebraska, how connected you are to the earth. I realize that since I visited, now I might be wrong about this, but didn't Omaha become one of the fastest internet places on earth? Isn't that right? At least the New York Times reported that, at least. But it doesn't seem to me that that would in any way disconnect you from the earth, not from what I experienced a few years ago. And because of that, I believe that you have a deep understanding of the passage I read from the 7th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, lifting up the importance of building your house on a rock. Now, when I use this passage back home in Massachusetts, I can interpret it literally, especially when I'm preaching out on Cape Cod, where houses are falling into the ocean. But the truth Jesus exhorts is not limited to a literal interpretation. Jesus' words can illuminate the foundation of our lives, our society, and even our civilization. The things we care about, the things our lives depend upon, are changing. It's as if we are learning that the basis, the very foundation upon which we have built our society, is vulnerable in ways humans never imagined. People in my hometown in Boston are learning firsthand what scientists have said for years, that climate change has melted 40% of the polar ice cap, and that has made the atmosphere 5% wetter. As it turns out, the greatest impact of these two changes is being experienced in New England right now, where people are now suffering through a 70% increase in extreme precipitation events. That's meteorologist language for huge snowfalls. But my neighbors in the Northeast are not alone. People in West Texas and in Arizona and in California are in the midst of what scientists are now referring to as a 1,000-year drought. And they certainly aren't surprised to learn that each passing year is likely to be the hottest year ever recorded, as 2014 was. And here in the Midwest, while you are accustomed to dramatic weather events, the extremes that are likely to come with climate change are on an entirely different scale for the region's businesses, the region's communities, and the overall economic health of the region. Climate change is already testing our coastal cities, our farms, our national parks, and our rivers. It's also already testing the poor, the marginalized, the elderly, the hungry, and the homeless. Under these circumstances, our usual understanding of hope is insufficient. So let me now share with you what for me is one of the most hopeful stories of our time. Pardon me if I take a drink. In a place not far, and in a time quite near, there were some teenagers who were distinguished most of all by their fearless courage and uncompromising hope. You knew that they were fearlessly courageous because even though they were only teenagers, they had devoted years of their lives to facing up to the thing that stopped most people in their tracks. And of their hope, Well, their hope was like the young shepherd David, as he quieted his trembling hands so that he could gather up a few small stones. Their hope was like that of the Indian champion of nonviolence, who once said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight with you, and then you win. Their hope was like that of the carpenter's son, who assured those around him that they could move mountains and that the truth would set them free. A few years earlier, these children learned much of what most of us now know. In only 7 generations, humans have burned about half the known carbon reserves that nature took 150 million years to make. We've made the oceans 30% more acidic. We've set the stage for most of Miami and much of Boston to be underwater before our grandchildren die. We've made 2014 the warmest year on record. We've assured that the pace of global warming is 10 times faster than any time over the past 65 million years. And we've increased the rate of species extinction by 1,000-fold. No child should have to hear this. But unlike many of us, upon hearing this, these children fearlessly persisted in their questioning. How could this happen? Why isn't the whole world focused on this? How can people be doing the same thing they've always done as if everything is going to continue the same way it always has? Isn't anybody in charge? These questions were prompted by what they had learned in elementary and middle school. That the world was organized into countries, and our country was organized into 50 states. And that our leaders were responsible to assure that we live in safety, and that the world into which we were born would continue in a way that would give us opportunities not unlike those afforded to our parents and our grandparents. Their fearless courage allowed them not to avert their attention. It allowed them to see that the very assurance of continuity of life was in jeopardy, and that most of the leaders were unwilling to take any action, and that many of those leaders denied there even was a problem. In addition to fearless courage, these teenagers were marked by uncompromising hope, and they expressed their hope by taking action. They teamed up with some attorneys and some filmmakers, and then together they made a case to protect the climate based on the public trust doctrine. The public trust doctrine, which stretches all the way back to Roman times, is well established in American law and in other legal traditions throughout the world. It states that it is the duty of the government to protect the natural resources that are essential for our collective survival and prosperity. Rivers, groundwater, the seashore, and in this case, the atmosphere cannot be privatized or substantially impaired, because these natural resources belong to everyone equally, including those not yet born. I said they made a case. In fact, they have taken legal action in almost all 50 states and have pending cases in 5 states, including my home state of Massachusetts. The best way to learn more about their prophetic and hopeful action is to watch the TV show that Bill Moyers chose to be his final TV program when he interviewed the legal mind behind this organization, which is called Our Children's Trust. Not only is the work of Our Children's Trust built upon legal principles that are thousands of years old, these young people are calling us to embrace moral principles that are as solid as the rock upon which Jesus would have us build the foundations of our lives. Now, in keeping with the inspiring witness of these young people, I want to lift up two spiritual practices that I believe are the adult equivalent of the courageous and hopeful work these children are leading. Two practices that I believe all people of faith and faith communities are called to embrace today: civil disobedience and divestment from fossil fuel companies. To illustrate the spiritual practice of civil disobedience, let me ask for a show of hands. How many of you have heard of the Keystone XL pipeline? Right? Seems like an obvious question, doesn't it? And you know that the company TransCanada is the corporation that's behind it, and you probably know that it can only be built if the president approves it, and you also, I'm guessing, know that it's been delayed since October 2011, thanks to thousands of people like Kim Morrow and Jane Klebe and others affiliated with Bold, Nebraska, and perhaps some of you as well. In August 2011, 1,253 people were arrested at the White House, and 63 of us spent 3 days and nights in jail. We did this because there's a pool of tar sands in Western Canada that is the second largest carbon deposit in the world. Canada doesn't have the technology to turn this sludge into useful fuel, but we do. However, to make that happen, a pipeline must be built, and as most of you know, that pipeline is to pass through the Dakotas to Texas, right over Nebraska's Ogallala Aquifer. Our hope was to get the attention of the president and of this nation. But let's face it, this is a David and Goliath situation. The proponents continue to spend unlimited funds on lobbying, falsely promoting the pipeline as a jobs creator, falsely suggesting that extracting and processing this sludge will bring America energy independence, and discrediting people like me. And as we all know, money talks, and large sums of corporate money drive both public policy and popular opinion. Nevertheless, as advocates for the earth, we can be persistent. So on Ash Wednesday in 2013, I was arrested again, this time with Robert F. Kennedy and his son, civil rights leader Julian Bond, actress Daryl Hannah, NASA climatologist James Hansen, Bill McKibben, and 40 others, when we cuffed ourselves to the White House fence. And 4 days later, 50,000 people marched past the White House. And between 2011 and 2013, opponents of the Keystone Pipeline, many of them here in Nebraska, confronted President Obama on every public appearance he made. Well and good. But what difference did this make? Well, thanks to our arrests and other activity, including the critically important work being done here in Nebraska. Since 2011, the Keystone XL pipeline has become a household word. No one had heard of it before the summer of 2011. At a minimum, our efforts have successfully delayed the completion of the pipeline by more than 1,000 days, and thus kept more than 850 million barrels of Canadian tar sands from being processed and released into the atmosphere. And then, thanks to the delay achieved by activists, on July 1st, 2014, TransCanada's permit to build the South Dakota section of the pipeline that was issued way back in 2010, that permit timed itself out, because in 2010, when they asked for a 4-year permit, it was unimaginable that this thing could stretch out for 4 years. Farmers, ranchers, tribal leaders, climate activists, they joined together in solidarity and hope to see to it that this was the outcome in South Dakota. And then, of course, there's the brilliant and persistent work that's been done here in Nebraska. Earlier this month, Nebraskan landowners won a huge victory when a Holt County District Court judge halted TransCanada's attempt to use eminent domain to take their land for the Keystone XL pipeline. And though I was stuck in an airport all day today, I believe the headlines read that this judgment has now been made firm. So regardless of what President Obama does, there's going to be no pipeline built in Nebraska, at least for 18 months and maybe for 3 years. So while the Keystone XL pipeline is only one of thousands of pipelines, activists have made it a symbol of what must be stopped and a symbol of the power people have to take action on this issue that seems so big we can hardly imagine how we would take action. So I invite you to join me and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Henry David Thoreau and the apostles Peter and Paul. And I remind you, Peter and Paul spent more time in jail than out of jail between the resurrection and their death. I invite you to join us in affirming civil disobedience as a normative expression of Christian discipleship. Civil disobedience has long been used as a tactic of last resort, appealing to moral conscience in order to make difficult societal changes. Most social change movements have incorporated civil disobedience as part of their strategy. Can there be any doubt that we are living in a time where last resort tactics are called for? As everyone here knows, the changes we need to make are enormous. It's no wonder that President Obama has shown ambivalence. And this makes it abundantly clear for the need for a massive social popular uprising that will drive the president to do what science says he must. And for our leaders in Washington, it's going to be a long road from being in the pockets of big oil to passing climate change legislation. I believe that elected politicians will walk that road only in response to organizing, protest, and civil disobedience. And of course, let's not forget that most towns have either pipelines or rail corridors over which coal or oil is carried. So there are ample opportunities for every house of worship to study, learn, organize, and engage. Can you hear the call to worship being shouted across the railroad track? Can you imagine passing the offering plate to your neighbor by reaching over a pipeline and then passing it to the policeman? Such a surge in local activism would not only convince the president to go beyond his veto and cancel the Keystone XL pipeline, it would prompt him to announce a commitment to end federal subsidies to coal, oil, and gas industries and use those funds to launch an unprecedented effort to develop renewable energies, not unlike what Germany has already done for years. And finally, such eco-justice activism could give the president the incentive he needs to do what he knows he must, to become the chief advocate for laws and policies that will result in keeping 80% of the known fossil fuel reserves in the ground so that our children and our grandchildren will have a planet worth inhabiting. Such a series of commitments could then serve to dramatically reset the ongoing negotiations in anticipation of the international climate talks that will be held in Paris in December 2015. So now I want to lift up a second spiritual practice that I believe is the adult equivalent of the courageous and hopeful work being done by our Children's Trust. As with the spiritual practice of civil disobedience, I believe all people of faith and faith communities are called to embrace divestment from fossil fuel companies. Here's why. As grown-ups, we recognize that we are morally responsible not only for our words, our actions, and our choices, but also for what has been entrusted to us. Few dispute that the fate of the earth is in our hands. Indeed, it hinges on decisions our generation will make in the next few years. And there's another dimension to this. Not only are we morally responsible for what has been entrusted to us, we're morally responsible for what we own, our assets. For those of us with personal financial assets, as well as for churches and colleges, government pension funds, charitable foundations, we now have the opportunity to demonstrate responsibility for the earth that has been entrusted to us by assuring that our assets are not invested in companies which, if all they do is fulfill their mission, they will wreck the earth. These are the stakes. Fossil fuel companies now own or have the right to tap 5 times the amount of carbon it will take to end life as we know it. If we allow fossil fuel companies simply to carry out their business plan, life as we know it will cease. And so humanity's challenge is to create moral conditions that will cause those companies to do what science now says we must, to leave the vast majority of these carbon reserves in the ground. This is what economists refer to as stranded assets, and their current value would be measured in trillions of dollars. Divestment is one of the means by which people of faith can help lead an effort that will revoke the social license the fossil fuel companies require to continue to carry out business as usual. One of the reasons why Jesus was able to inspire the greatest mass movement in the history of the world is that he extended the horizon of what people thought was possible. Yes, you can feed 5,000 people with what you already have. Yes, you can forgive even the most grievous harm done to you or a loved one. Yes, you can give away half of what you own and come and follow me. Can we receive Jesus' inspiration? Can we embrace the fearless courage and uncompromising hope offered by our children's trust? I believe we can. In fact, I believe that this is now the vocation of the church, the synagogue, and the mosque, to create a moral climate rooted in science that compels the most profitable industry the world has ever known to walk away from what it claims as its assets. The oil, gold, coal, and gas that nature took hundreds of millions of years to create is not the property of the fossil fuel company, nor is it the property of its shareholders. As Psalm 24 reminds us, the earth is the Lord's. And as our children's trust reminds us, the atmosphere belongs to everyone equally, including those not yet born. As you may know, in December 2012, the Massachusetts Conference, United Church of Christ, that I lead, became the first religious body in America to pass a resolution to call upon the church to divest from fossil fuel companies. And then on July 1st, 2013, our national United Church of Christ Synod became the first national body and the first denomination to vote to divest from fossil fuel companies. Before the vote, our national UCC leaders wrote this: We believe that God is calling the United Church of Christ to become the leading religious voice on climate change and environmental racism. And as officers of the church, this public leadership requires us to state our conviction that our church's resources not be invested in fossil fuel companies. After the vote, I received congratulations from a Nobel Prize laureate, along with the head of the Episcopal Church, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu emailed me his congratulations, and he concluded it by saying, "We hope others will follow your splendid example." Now let me be clear. Advocating for divestment is controversial. Anytime a minister mixes morality and money, he or she is asking for trouble. And yet Jesus had more to say about money and material possessions than any other topic. More than love, more than prayer. He had more to say about money and material possessions than any other topic except the kingdom of God. But what I began to realize was that many in the church had lost sight of the crucial role we so often discount or ignore. We actually have the power, in concert with other political and popular forces, to bend the arc of justice. And thank God for our denomination's United Church funds. On November 1st, 2014, they launched the first denomination-based fund that is free of fossil fuel company stocks. It opened with $22 million of investments. And as a crucial part of our divestment effort, I believe the church should join those seeking to reinterpret the current understanding of fiduciary responsibility. The word fiduciary comes from fides, which is our word. It means keeping faith. And we have ceded this word to the investment industry and to the legal experts. Humanity can no longer allow directors of investment firms or pensions to claim the moral and legal high ground when all they do is maximize short-term monetary profit. If the business plan of a company, however profitable, will wreck the home of the investors if that business plan is carried out, such an investment is a breach of fiduciary responsibility. Okay, there you have it. Two spiritual practices: civil disobedience and divestment. While it may be hard to accept, I believe that these are the adult equivalents of the courageous and hopeful work done by our Children's Trust, and I believe that all people of faith and faith communities are called to embrace these two spiritual disciplines. Beyond this, it's also worth asking, what would the church look like if it took climate change seriously? If you're interested in pursuing that question during our Q&A time, I'm more than glad to engage it. But now let me draw my formal comments to a conclusion. Humanity is now facing a moral, spiritual, economic, and cultural challenge no less than that of slavery. Hear these words from the great abolitionist leader, Frederick Douglass. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its mighty waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one. And it may be both moral and physical, but it must be struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did. It never will. when Frederick Douglass said those words in 1857, the possibility of abolishing slavery remained a hopeless and naive prospect, even after decades of efforts. And so I say to you, within our lifetime, mining coal, drilling for oil, mountaintop removal, and fracking will all become as morally repugnant and intolerable to us as it would be to own slaves today. Thanks to the abolition movement, as well as the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the GLBTQ movement, we know that society itself can be redirected. Science makes clear that the need for this redirection is immediate, and history suggests that this can only happen if faith leaders like you are recognizing that our leadership is essential to create a world worth saving. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a few minutes for question and answer. I recently was reminded that it is important in settings like these to remind the audience to be respectful of others and that the questions be questions and not mini speeches. So if you just raise your hand if you have a question that you would like to direct to Jim, and we will get a microphone to you.
Thank you for your leadership on divestment. I'm a United Methodist, and we're going to be making efforts for our General Conference in 2016. Can you give us some resources to talk to those in our church? I mean, do you have 2 or 3 quick little articles, that we can give our fiduciary agents that are going to talk their language?
So I have been asked this question countless times by people from other denominations, and I've come to see that this work that we succeeded at in the United Church of Christ was, it constitutes like a legitimate miracle, I don't know which of the biblical miracles you might draw the analogy to. I'll leave that up to some of you. It's really hard. It's really hard. And the reason it's really hard is because, for example, people who put their money into pensions deserve to have the maximum they might legitimately get from their pensions. So you can't duck that issue. The problem is, what if it turns out that by a calculus that pretty much everybody would agree to if they didn't have personal investment in it, by that calculus, it turns out that that benefit that they would be getting from their pensions the way they're currently invested is a robbery from our grandchildren. That's the problem. Nobody wants to steal from their grandchildren, right? So, all right, so that I could go on and on. You guys can imagine. This is why I have a script, because if I just sort of go, I really don't know where it goes. So there are some. If you want to email me, I would be gratefully receive your email. I have been in touch with a few Methodists, but with a whole lot more Episcopalians. Episcopalians are getting a week ago. Their highest executive body decided that this conversation will not take place at their national meeting this summer. They have a new presiding bishop to elect and so forth. Just to tell you what the kind of thing I do. So I've written the presiding bishop, who is a friend of mine, and I've told her, this is the opportunity of your life. She's an oceanographer. This is the opportunity of her life to go out advocating for something that would fail, probably, but would be the right thing to do, right? So the reason I say all of those words out loud is to try to spark each of you. What would it be like for me to go out advocating for something that may fail, but it would be the right thing to do? Because that's the kind of thinking we have to engage as disciples. in this day and age. There's so many things that are important to be connected with. And I know that I can sound like a one-issue person, but it turns out this issue is the container issue of all the others. It leverages, it amplifies, it makes worse all the other social justice issues. And we all know that, but what the problem is, it's like, okay, so what should I do? And thanks be to God for Nebraskans, because many folks in Nebraskans have found something concrete to do. Thanks be to God for these kids. This is why I talk about these kids in this sermon. Is say, my God, teenagers can figure out what to do. Maybe I can too. Maybe my church can too. Okay. Another question.
Thank you for coming to Omaha. Have you heard of the R project? That's an expansion of these great big huge electrical power grid lines going through Nebraska. Has anybody heard of that? It's violating all sorts of fish and wildlife routes. It's creating havoc in an area which the Keystone would go through. And they have decided upon a route that is one of the most fragile ecosystems in North America. Every time they put one of the great big huge metal power lines in the ground, they create something called a blowout. The ground becomes sterile. Cattle can't graze. Anyway, I just have this theory. I'd like your opinion. Do you think there's any credence, or am I possibly paranoid, that the lesser population areas are more prone to becoming abused by fossil fuel forces just because there are fewer people who will speak up?
So you're not paranoid in this regard. The United Church of Christ, our denomination, about 35 years ago, essentially asked the same question you just asked, except it asked the question, do you think that it's a coincidence that the most polluted parts of America happen to be in neighborhoods where people of color are most dense? And as a consequence of asking that question, research was done that verified the thought, and the term environmental racism was coined, and that has been a huge contribution to the justice movement broadly in America and in the world. It's a parallel question that you're asking. I can give you a specific example in Massachusetts. We are fighting the possibility of a new natural gas pipeline coming through Massachusetts. And the original plan had it coming through a certain bunch of towns in western Massachusetts. And then those towns all got upset and started giving voice to their opposition. And then they came out with Plan B, which were all these towns with much less population density, exactly to your point. And their presumption is that there'll be less people like me, or maybe less churches, like I was suggesting in my comments, offering communion over a pipeline corridor and claiming it for the people instead of for the fossil fuels. So there's definitely something in what you're saying. And I mean, just so that you know, as a non-Nebraskan, looking at what Nebraskan ranchers and cattlemen and Native Americans and others have done together and bonding together with the resistance that you've done here, what it shows is regardless of the population density, people can rise up, people can come together. And that's an important lesson. So thank you for your question.
Okay, so can I go next? I'll stand up for a second and then I'll sit back down. I actually have two questions, so please don't let me forget the second one. But the first one speaks to the conversation about the pipeline. And I've literally convinced hundreds of people personally and called my congressmen and senators and left very elaborate messages on their voicemail, giving them a different soundbite that they can use that sounds much more intelligent than the conversation that's happening now. And I guess I'm asking you, how come we don't have a better message? I mean, to me, my message is, look, folks, they're going to use that oil for X amount of years and it's going to make the earth dirtier. 50, 100 years, however long it takes to do that. It's stretching a tube, a metal tube that's fastened with bolts across a water resource that we will literally use for thousands of years. And it's not just Nebraska, it's like 9 states that rely upon this water for not just agriculture, for their big pivots that raise the crops and to feed the livestock, but it's what we drink. It's like, it's guaranteeing that we'll have life possible here on this continent for 1,000 years. They're going to stretch this tube across there, and it'll probably find a way to leak, and the terrorists could find a way to make it leak. Somebody could drive a truck into it. What's the removal plan for the pipeline fossil fuel companies? How come we aren't leaving them hanging, going, we don't know the answer to that? You know, how come it's always like, you know, jobs and money and we need oil, right? How can we change that conversation to be like, oh, obviously we don't want this thing, right?
So there are many alternative messages. Yours is a very good one, but there are many alternative messages. In tandem with what you have said, I would just remind you all, ready to be astonished, in 14 seconds, the Earth receives enough solar energy to power all of the power needs of the Earth for a year. So what if on the evolution of technology, instead of Drake finding a pool of sludge in 1857, what if, I mean, obviously this is impossible, what if instead, you know, a solar power chip had, some guy had come up with it in his cave, and we had actually tapped into this great gift that we have had from the beginning of time. It's in keeping with your message, which is comparing the short-term benefit to the long-term benefit. But the dilemma, I think, is less the inadequacy of the message. The dilemma is the reality that short-term monetary profit interests are what is driving this train. And full disclosure, my dad served for 42 years in Mobil Oil Company and ended up being its head chemical engineer. So I was talking about Canadian tar sands when I was 7 years old in 1957, and my father, who was a chemist and a designer of oil refineries, that oil refinery in California that blew up a week and a half ago, my dad designed it. I used to work there. My dad said it would never be economically feasible to tap the oil in Canada, because it would never be economically feasible to remove all the sludge from that. And then, lo and behold, he designed this oil refinery in Beaumont, Texas, which is one of the ones that can actually process this sludge. And that's where the Keystone Pipeline goes to, is one of my dad's refineries. So that was your first question, and I don't think it's message, I think it's money. I think it's profit. And that's why, just to connect the dots so that the lights go on for all of you, that's why my emphasis in this talk, in case I wasn't direct enough, is about intergenerational responsibility. Short-term profit ignores intergenerational profitability. And climate change is a calculation in which, if we maximize short-term benefit for, whether it's for jobs or any other kind of claim, that we are actually canceling the long-term prospects of our children. So that's the ethical trade-off that we have going. The other ethical reality that is really important to see, that every church could be speaking to, is the difference between something that has a local impact, where actions and consequences are held locally, and something that has a global impact. Because to your comments about pipelines, everything you say about pipelines is true, and I totally agree with it, but you didn't even begin to address the climate issue, which is the consequence of burning this particular oil that flows through that pipeline. You had a second question.
Yeah, and the second question, I guess I'll just lay the background that I've admired the civil disobedience, or at least the folks who are brave enough to, pull that off and then collectively be large enough to make a difference. And I've been inspired by your description, and it's a little bit easier to see it as part of almost a duty. But I wanted to ask you, before I lay myself across a railroad track or round up a bunch of folks to go, stand in front of the pipeline bulldozers. When you were there at the White House, or when you're in your civil disobedience, do you remember anything anybody saying that was particularly valuable in keeping the group together, or keeping the folks focused, or keeping people from de facto, walking off, or breaking their nonviolent intentions? Like, what's the words of encouragement that you can give me today that I'll share someday down the road?
This is such a lovely question. I just love this question.
Thanks.
So no one's ever asked me this question. It's so wonderful. So I was the only out clergy. That's a funny word to use, but it's true. I had my collar on. Whenever I get arrested, I always have my collar on. And I was the only out clergy, if you will, in this group. And they all thought it was cool to have a clergy person there for the kind of reasons that you're getting at, right? And what often happens, the background to your question, what often happens in civil disobedience is, first, it takes a lot of ego to do civil disobedience, right? Yeah, it takes a lot of moral turpitude. And then when you get a bunch of egos together, it can be very splintering and not coalescing, right? So to your point, it takes a lot of work. Anytime I've ever done civil disobedience, any civil disobedience I've ever heard of, it's always the case that the day before you do a night's training. And one of the things that does is it creates a group bonding, because usually it's strangers that are coming together. But if churches were doing it here, there, and everywhere along a pipeline, you folks would already know each other. So the splintering kind of thing that you're talking about would be less likely if you're with a church group. You begin to see the connection with that. But then straightforwardly to your question, people are scared to do civil disobedience. There was 2 Yale Divinity School students who were part of the 63 of us that spent 3 days and nights in jail. And the woman who later became this young man's wife, she talked about her fear. And her talking about her fear helped everybody else to say, I'm a little scared too. And then we had these advisors. I'm not going to help the cause by saying what I'm about to say, but I'll tell you the truth. We had these legal advisors who were saying, the likelihood that you'll spend the night in jail is like 0. It's like 99% sure they're not going to hold you. And there were all kinds of reasons at that time. But it turns out they held us for 3 days and nights in the D.C. jails, which are among the worst jails, city jails in the country. Just stainless steel slab that I slept on with a night light that was on 24/7 right above my face. I'm a vegetarian, but I'm not a vegan. They're obligated to feed you every 12 hours. The first sandwich that we got was ham and cheese. So I peeled off the ham and gave it to my cellmate. And then I ate half of the sandwich, and I said, what, they can have me, but they can't have my appetite. And I fasted for the rest of the time, the rest of the 3 days. And I had not fasted in a long time. When I was younger and I was like a big Gandhi follower and stuff, I fasted quite a lot, but I had not fasted in like 30 years. But things like that, so then I talked about that to the cell block, because, you can talk through the cell bars. And what happens is you inspire each other. I heard the best economics lecture in my life. And I went to Princeton as an undergraduate, and Bert Malkiel, who is a very famous economist, was one of my econ teachers there. But I heard the best economics lecture in my life in jail, because 75-year-old Gus Spaeth, who was former dean of the School of Forestry at Yale and advisor to 3 presidents, founder of the National Resource Defense Council and so forth, Gus decided to get arrested with us. And one of the things he did for inspiration, to hold the group together and to help people from drifting into despair, was to give an econ lecture on capitalism. it was mind-blowing. You know, we sang some songs, though this movement doesn't have anything like the song registry of the Civil Rights Movement, and we need to do some work if there's any songwriters out there. But there are people working on that, but I would encourage you Nebraskans to work on that too. So those are some of my responses to your question. Your heart is in the right place because you've already traveled some of the geography of this challenge. By your question, I can tell that, and so I will hold you in prayer as to what comes next. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Mark Welsh, and I want to thank you too for coming here today. It's been just inspirational to hear you speak about two things, civil disobedience and divestment. But being a Christian, I think of trilogy things, and we need three things, and the slavery needed three things. They needed the civil disobedience, they needed divestment, and they needed laws to be changed. And so, I'm part of the group that is the third part, the trilogy part of this movement, is to get laws changed to tax carbon and pay people through the Citizens Climate Lobby, which has that one goal. And it's now an international group, and we are making progress in other countries and actually getting laws passed. And we need to do that here in the United States much quicker. So I would urge you to add that trilogy part to your talks in the future. And if you have, if you talked with James Hansen, if you spent time with him in jail, maybe you could talk about that, because he is one of the board of directors of Citizens Climate Lobby.
I just want to say a word of support. It's absolutely the case that we're going to need to change laws, and what the Citizens Climate Lobby is proposing are, I think, the best stuff that is out there. So if any of you have interest in learning more about that, I would urge you and endorse going to the Citizens Climate Lobby in order to learn both about what the alternative approaches are, but also about what the best of those alternatives are. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I have a question about money, and you're suggesting follow the money. We're from Nebraska. We went to Nebraska Wesleyan University. I talked to the president of the university about Methodist school about divesting from fossil fuels. Got shot straight down. I've had the conversation more than once, and he says Board of Governors won't go for it. We've got to get maximum value on the investment. Is there research that shows these environmentally conscious funds, investments can do comparable? I mean, I'd be willing to start calling on the Board of Governors, take the board, work on them one by one. Is there, you've talked about money, all these PhDs, economists. Can these socially responsible investments mirror or come close to the others? Because if so, then maybe we can try to get some votes. We are in Nebraska, and to say, well, it's not going to make money, we have to have some counter-argument. I'm willing to forward the argument. I don't know if there's facts to support it.
So the first thing to say to this is that there is no facts to suggest that maintaining fossil fuel as a significant percentage of your portfolio is automatically going to guarantee you to make maximum profits, right? Fossil fuel companies go up and down. There are lousy ones. There are better ones. So that's the facts about fossil fuel companies. Those facts are no different than about what you might replace them with, correct? Investing is a roll of the dice. There are plenty of socially responsible investing opportunities. In fact, when the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation declared that it was going to divest from its fossil fuel holdings, okay? So if that didn't hit your radar screen, on September 21st, the day before, I forget it, the People's Climate March in New York City, the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, $860 million, all of that money from Standard Oil, right? Rockefeller. All that money from Standard Oil. They made a big public announcement they were going to divest. It turns out, as is true with most portfolios, about 6% of their portfolio was fossil fuel companies. So we're only talking about 6% of the portfolio. And then it's just a matter of finding something reasonable to replace it. I am not an investment expert. I don't give investment advice or anything like that. So the dilemma with what you're up to is that it's like a whack-a-mole. Is that you go at it on the economic thing or on the moral thing, and then he raises the economic issue. You go at it on the economic issue, and then he raises, well, we're trying to maximize scholarships, and then you. So for me, at least, I have to pick and choose how I manifest my time. My board of directors, I'm a conference minister. I have 370 churches I'm responsible for, right? But I spend about 15 or 20% of my time doing climate change work for our denomination nationally as well as in my state. And my board of directors supports that 100%. So I've changed my vocation, what I think it means to be a denominational leader, because of the time I happen to be born into. And I have to pick and choose what I'm going to do that. So as I said a moment ago, I have an institution back home, and it has the third largest college endowment in the world. And I have not hammered them. I was arrested, however, back in 1972 at the president's office over the apartheid divestment issue. That's when I was just a young buck. And that was a good day. You have to realize and you just have to be persistent. It's like these kids. I mean, imagine, these are 17-year-olds who are suing our government. It's like, really? And they think they're going to win? If you watch that video, that Bill Moyers interview of this young 17-year-old woman, I guarantee you, when you turn off the TV, you'll say, she's going to win. I guarantee you'll come to that conclusion. And you can win too, but it takes a kind of persistence that our lives don't prepare us for. It's a different kind of persistence. But I can see it in your eyes. You're prepared for that. Yeah.
What do you want us to replace fossil fuels with? And why is there not more publicity about that and more money put into it?
So it turns out there is a ton of publicity about what we can replace fossil fuels with. For example, in 2014, more jobs were created. Excuse me. Let me start this again. In 2014, the needle shifted so that the number of people employed in the solar industry exceeds the number of people employed in the coal industry. Who knew? Why isn't this a headline? It's not because it's not a fact, right? So I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Don't conclude that from my intonation. But the reality is there's all kinds of good news that is going on in relation to alternatives to fossil fuel that, for whatever reason, isn't hitting our headlines. For example, in Germany, anybody been to Germany? Germany is like cloudy all the time, right? In the summer, there were several weeks this past summer, where Germany got 70% of its energy from either wind or solar. Germany? You kidding me? Now, why did that happen? It happened because 20 years ago, Germany made a commitment to build an infrastructure that would make this transition possible. Full disclosure, that commitment included nuclear power as being a key component. And then, when the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan melted down, 2 months later, Angela Merkel, who is a physicist, show of hands, how many knew that the leader of Germany is a physicist? Anyone? Thank you. But I say that by way of like what publicity gets out. Like, why don't we know that she's a physicist, right? Angela Merkel changed the timeline for the conversion, and she took the timeline for nuclear and shrunk it to 7 years, and they're ahead of schedule on phasing out their nuclear plants, and they're way ahead of schedule on becoming entirely fossil fuel independent. So the dilemma, I don't know how to say this. I don't know how to say this, except to say it straightforwardly. You know, the dilemma is that our country has a capital infrastructure that is so indebted to fossil fuel that the mountain we're trying to climb, it's Sisyphusian. You know, we're rolling this rock up this mountain. But it's the right fight. If you have to call every single one of those people on the Board of Governors, it's the right fight. It takes a kind of persistence that, if in fact you read your Bible, you will find examples of people's persistence in Scripture. And not to take it lightly, the way I have much of my life, but to take it for its full moral suasion and claim on our lives. We actually, all of us, we have to repurpose our lives as we continue to claim our discipleship. And to me, it's a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity. You are so lucky to have a leader like this to go through this time in our human life together. I just really want to say that. I wish that all of our congregations had somebody like you, Eric.
I have a question. You mentioned earlier about 80% and that you would be satisfied with using 20%. Is that to satisfy the leaders of the headquarters of the two great fossil fuel transporters in the United States here in Omaha?
Help me out on the 80 and 20% of what you're referring to.
You mentioned 80%. We would need to decrease that in the next 20 years or whatever, indicating that we're going to continue to use 20% fossil fuels.
So I think what I said was that we need to leave 80% of the fossil fuel in the ground. Is that what you're referring to?
That may be.
Yes, that's it. And because the reality is, we're not going to throw a switch and all of a sudden stop using gas, all of a sudden stop using fossil fuel. That's not going to happen. But if we don't commit real soon, like in the next couple of years, to a path of decrease, then if you add up all the fossil fuel we're going to continue to use, it's going to be a number much greater than the 20% number that the scientists say is the most we can use to keep the temperature increase below 2 degrees centigrade. The dilemma, I can't tell you what it's like to have gotten 85 inches of snow in less than a month in Boston, which has no capacity. I was hearing about Montreal removes, I think the ratio was 300,000 trucks loads of snow every year, and we've removed 30,000 truckloads of snow, and we think it's impossible. But Montreal has us down, But my point is, this will sound funny. Boston wasn't meant to get this much snow. I know that sounds funny, and don't draw bad conclusions from that. But my point is that we really are. It's a much easier description to talk about the island of Tuvalu or the Maldives. These are countries that are no more than 1.5 feet above sea level. That's the highest land they have, 1.5 feet above sea level, and they're going to be underwater in either 10 years or 25 years or something in between, right? And so if we can limit it to burning only 20% of the known reserves and enact laws that will disallow the utilization of that other 80%, then maybe the Maldives get to 1 inch above sea level and things work out. But if we go to using 30% of the known reserves or 40% of the known reserves, I know it sounded extreme when I was giving my formal presentation, but life as we know it will end. The world will be full of very rich people who will have all the protection they need and war. Period. And it's just I'm not a crazy person. I just can't imagine how would that not happen? I don't see how it would not happen. But we do have this window now to get something done which is why I try to be as tireless as I am in this endeavor.
Well, we have come to the end of our time, our formal time. I want to thank Dr. Antal for his time with us, and you guys for your great questions. We do have time, we have coffee and cookies, and I would really encourage you to take this out to the common grounds. David, if he would raise his hand there, and you can go out to the couch with David, and we can continue the conversation out with coffee that warms us and cookies that make us happier, and we can do that out there. But also to be stopping at the table with Mark and Kim as far as some of the things. One thing in particular is there is a climate conference in March that we have flyers for, and to get the word out about that, to again just get that critical mass going. So I want to thank you for that. Also, those of you that you did get evaluation cards, it's very helpful to us if you fill out those evaluation cards. And if you are not currently getting the emails or notices about these events, the back of the evaluation card, if you would be so kind as to give us your name and email, we'll be sure to keep you up to date on events coming up. Thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you.